cannot believe. I cannot believe this.
What do you mean? You can't believe what?
You are going to try to blame me for killing my children and my daughter.
Over the years, we've all heard the shocking stories of cheaters who somehow end up becoming family annihilators. And today's case, well, it's one for the books. This one took a staggering 13 years to unravel, and the crazy part is, it flipped everything we thought we knew about cheaters and killers on its head. David Camm, a man once suspected of killing his entire family, is at the center of this mind-bending story. But was he really the killer, or did someone else pull the strings? And if it wasn't him, who was capable of such a horrific act? Trust me, this is one of the most twisted and mind-boggling mysteries you'll ever hear. And just like always, we're going to break down every detail of this case, piece by piece.
Jury selection is now underway in one of the most controversial local murder cases in recent history. David Camm.
This is David and Kimberly Camm. The two grew up in the same city, New Albany, Indiana, and crossed paths back in the mid-1980s. They hit it off, and by 1989, Kim had become David's second wife. Things seemed to be heading in the right direction. That same year, David applied to join the Indiana State Police, and before long, he was accepted, eventually working as a police officer in the Emergency Response Unit. Fast forward a few years to 1993, and the couple welcomed their first child together, a boy named Bradley. It was Kim's first baby, but David's second, as he already had a daughter from his previous marriage. Life seemed to be good for the growing Camm family. But things began to unravel in the summer of 1994, when David started an affair with a younger woman named Stephanie McCarty, someone he met at the gym. This betrayal couldn't have come at a worse time for Kim. She was pregnant with their second child. The situation escalated quickly. David moved out of their home and into his mistress's, leaving Kim to lean on her family for support. Despite everything, both her family and David's stayed by her side, offering the help she needed during such a challenging time. When Kim gave birth to their daughter, Jillian, on February 28, 1995, both sides of the family showed up for support. Everyone, that is, except David. By March of that year, however, the affair ended, and David sought reconciliation. Despite the heartbreak, Kim considered giving him another chance, driven by her love for her family and her role as a mother. Surprisingly, David moved back in, and Kim's decision to forgive him was met with support from both families. Soon after, they began building a new home on Lockhart Road in Georgetown, Indiana, a fresh start for the reunited couple. They chose to live in this location because of its personal connection. The road was actually named after some of David's relatives on his mother's side, adding a layer of history and significance to their home. For a while, things seemed to improve, and it looked like they were on the right track. But as the saying goes, once a cheater, always a cheater. David, known for being a flirt, didn't just stop at flirting. He would find women to have casual affairs with, often using his patrol car as his hookup spot. On top of that, David was involved in a lawsuit with 2 other state troopers, accused of assaulting a 19-year-old during an arrest. To add to his already shaky record, there were numerous other complaints filed against him. His ego took a hit when he got demoted yet again, which only fueled his narcissistic tendencies. Fed up with the lack of respect, David made a bold move. He handed in his resignation and joined his uncle's basement waterproofing business, landing a sales position. Suddenly, the perks were clear. His new job gave him better hours, meaning he was actually around more often for Kim and the kids, something he hadn't been able to do as a state trooper. Now, he wasn't just a stranger in his own home. He was there, involved. Plus, he was making way more money than he ever did as a cop, which added a touch of luxury to their lives. By the year 2000, everything seemed to be falling into place for the family. Bradley, now 7 years old, was doing great in 2nd grade at Graceland Christian School, while his little sister Jill, just 5, was in kindergarten at the same school. Kim was thriving in her job as a senior accountant at Insurance Group in Louisville. From the outside, life seemed perfect now. But even in this seemingly happy home, there were still whispers about David's possible cheating. The rumors had been floating around, and Kim had even shared her worries with her best friend. But despite all the gossip, nothing ever came of it, until one fateful evening in September. On Thursday, September 28, 2000, David followed his usual routine, playing basketball with friends at the local church rec center. Kim, as always, took care of the kids' activities and got them home. It was just another regular evening. However, the game ran later than David had expected. By the time he was done, he was in a hurry to get home, worried Kim might be upset. Their house was just a few minutes away, so he grabbed his garage door remote and pulled into the driveway. But as the garage door slowly opened, what David saw inside stopped him dead in his tracks. In the garage, his wife Kim was lying on the floor with what appeared to be a gunshot wound to her head. A pool of blood spread across the floor beneath her. The passenger door of her black Ford Bronco was open, but David couldn't immediately tell if his kids were in the car. He rushed to the Bronco and looked inside. In the back seat, his worst fears came true. His children, Jill and Bradley, were in the same horrifying condition as Kim. David's law enforcement instincts took over. He quickly assessed the situation and realized Kim and Jill were beyond saving. David Camm believed his son might still be alive since the boy showed no signs of head injuries. Acting on hope, he climbed into the passenger side of the Bronco, maneuvered through the two front bucket seats, and carefully lifted his son out. And when he touched Bradley, he felt a faint warmth in his small body. He placed the boy on the garage floor and began administering CPR. During this process, David's left knee pressed into the middle of the back seat, which caused Jill's head and body to slump forward and to the left. This motion brought her into contact with David's t-shirt, leaving traces of blood on it. Now, this moment became one of the most critical points in the case. Whether David was guilty or not, his actions now intertwined his DNA with the crime scene. And when his efforts failed, reality hit him like a truck. David knew he needed to act quickly. In a panic, he called the Indiana State Police Department, his former workplace, for help.
Indiana State Police Radio, Patrice, can I help you?
Patrice, it's Dave Camm. Let me talk to Post Command right now.
Okay, he's on another line.
Right now, let me talk to Post Command.
Hold on.
You're my only truth. I need you like
Dave? Get everybody out here to my house now. Okay, all right. My wife and my kids are dead. Get everybody out here to my house. Go to Dave Camm's house now. Signal 10. Okay, David, we got people on the way, okay? Get everybody out here. Come here. Everything's going to be okay, all right? We're going to get people... Everything's not okay. Get everybody out here now. They're coming. Go to Dave Camm's house now.
After the call, he sprinted across the street to his uncle's house, shouting for someone to tell him what had happened. He then dashed back to the garage, consumed with confusion and fear. When the police arrived at the scene, they found Kim exactly as David had described, her body lying on the floor with her pants removed, blood trailing from her head. Nearby, Bradley's lifeless body was found, while Jill's body was in the back seat of the car. It was immediately suspected that all three victims had been shot to death. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Now, in the garage, there was a bucket that reeked of bleach. The detectives also found some unidentified fingerprints on the outside of Kim's car, but they didn't think much of it since she parked in a public lot every day for work, which could explain the prints. On the floor of the garage, tucked under Bradley's body, was a sweatshirt with the word backbone written inside the collar that no one seemed to recognize. When the police asked David about it, he claimed it wasn't his. As mentioned, Kim wasn't wearing any pants when she was found, only her underwear and shirt. However, her pants were nearby, covered in blood. And as with any murder case, the spouse is always the first one to be questioned, and David wasn't exempt from this, David was completely cooperative, providing a clear timeline of his day and explaining that Kim and the kids had probably come home around 7:30 or 7:40 p.m. Looking at the state of the car, David thought the murders must have happened almost immediately after they arrived home. Yet, he couldn't figure out who could have wanted to hurt his family. Kim and the kids weren't involved in anything that would have made them enemies, and when it came to his alibi, David stuck to his guns. He insisted that he was exactly where he said he'd be, at a basketball game at the rec center from 7 o'clock to 9:20 in the evening. David also kept insisting that Kim wouldn't have done anything to provoke this kind of violence. So, at first, the investigators wondered if it might have been a robbery gone wrong. But that idea didn't last long. There was no sign of forced entry into the garage, nothing seemed to be missing from the house, and no one had tried to get inside. The evidence was pointing away from theft and toward something much darker, a targeted attack on Kim, Bradley, and Jill. But the most damning evidence came later when the phone company revealed that David made a call at 7:19 p.m. on the night of the murders. The call was made from his home's landline, which was a huge red flag because David had claimed to be playing basketball from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. The fact that he made a call after 7 p.m. contradicted his story, and it raised serious doubts. The autopsy report added more to the mystery. All 3 victims had died from gunshot wounds, but the examiner also found that Jill had blunt force trauma to her genital area. This injury seemed to have occurred within the same 24-hour period as her death. The examiner suggested it might have been caused by a fall, but the possibility of an assault couldn't be ruled out. Strangely, Jill had complained of pain in that area during her dance class, even crying about it. Whether this had anything to do with the trauma to her body was uncertain, but it was a chilling detail. Kim had confided in a friend just before the murders, saying, "History is repeating itself." Kim didn't elaborate, but her friend suggested that she bring the kids down to Florida for a visit to talk more. Kim agreed that a trip might help, but tragically, she never got the chance. So, was Kim referring to a history of abuse? Perhaps something related to David's alleged infidelity, or possibly something darker. We may never know, as Kim was taken from her family before she could share the truth. The medical examiner's report also revealed something unsettling. Kim had cuts and bruises on the tops of her feet. Her shoes were oddly placed on top of the car, which just didn't make sense. The police had no clear explanation for any of this, and it was still early in the investigation. But people close to David, including Kim's mother, started to have serious doubts about him. Her mother believed that Jill, a sassy, outgoing child, would have spoken up if someone she wasn't familiar with had hurt her. The only person she thought might have been able to silence Jill was David. 3 days later, on Sunday, the rumors continued to swirl, especially since no arrest had been made yet. Despite the growing tension, David went to church with his parents and friends, just as he always did. His uncle, the pastor, led the service, and the church had strong connections to the family. Kim had served as the treasurer, and David's grandfather had even helped build the church. During the service, David cried the entire time, showing what seemed to be genuine emotion, but things took a dramatic turn as he left the church. A swarm of reporters surrounded him, and the media coverage quickly cast a shadow of suspicion over him. People couldn't help but notice that David didn't seem to be grieving in the way they expected. His cold, stoic demeanor raised more questions. Could David have been responsible for the brutal murders of his wife and children? And if so, why? Well, later that afternoon, David came into the station to speak with the police, and things got a bit heated.
I cannot believe this.
What do you mean? You can't believe what?
You are going to try to blame me for killing my children and my daughter.
Some of the blood or something like that.
No. This is ridiculous.
What about some bleach, Dave?
No.
After this interview, the police arrested him, and it all came down to 2 things: his shirt and a phone call. The call, made at 7:19 in the evening, didn't match his alibi of being at the rec center from 7 o'clock to 9:20 o'clock. That contradiction was enough to land him in custody. But the aftermath wasn't just about David. It was about his whole family. In the close-knit town of Georgetown, where everybody knows everybody, the Camm family became public enemy number one. Strangers gave them ugly stares. Their answering machine filled up with hateful messages. And if that wasn't enough, the local community started calling them a pack of wolves. The fallout even reached David's grandfather, whose church shut its doors because so many members wanted nothing to do with the Camm name. By March of 2002, it was trial time, and the prosecution came in hot, determined to answer the burning question: why would David do this? Their theory, his affairs. They argued David was so done with his marriage to Kim that instead of just filing for divorce, he chose the unthinkable of murdering his entire family. To sell this idea, the prosecution brought in about a dozen women who either had affairs with David or claimed he'd made a move on them while he was married to Kim. Over weeks of testimony, they painted David as a serial cheater with no respect for his marriage vows. Then came the evidence. The prosecution hung their case on two key pieces: blood spatter and that suspicious phone call. But the defense wasn't about to roll over. They argued the blood on David's shirt didn't come from gunfire. Instead, they said it got there when Jill's blood-soaked hair brushed against him while he was trying to save his son, Bradley. To prove it, they put on a live demonstration in court using wigs and fake blood, showing how the same pattern could easily happen. As for the phone call, the defense blamed Indiana's notoriously confusing time zones. They explained that the call's timestamp didn't account for a 1-hour difference between zones. When adjusted, the call actually fit David's timeline. It was made before he even left for his basketball game. And then there was David's alibi. Basketball. Every single one of the 11 guys on his team testified that he was at the church gym the entire time. He never left, not even for a minute. With this rock-solid lineup, it seemed like the defense had poked some serious holes in the prosecution's case. But the jury didn't see it that way. They convicted David on 3 counts of murder and 1 count of conspiracy, and he was sentenced to 195 years in prison. At first, it seemed like everyone could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Justice had been served, right? Well, not so fast. David wasn't ready to go down quietly. He appealed, arguing that the evidence about his affairs should have never been allowed in court. And guess what? In 2004, the judge agreed, overturning his conviction. Just like that, the case was thrown back into chaos. David's second trial was scheduled for January 2006, but something game-changing happened in early 2005. The defense pushed for another look at the DNA from the sweatshirt found at the crime scene. Specifically, they wanted the unknown DNA profiles, 2 of them, run through CODIS, the National DNA Database. The prosecution had previously refused, but after a court order, they were forced to comply. The test results came back with a match for one of the DNA samples, and it turned out this particular sample had never been tested before, even though the prosecutor had assured everyone it had been analyzed and found no matches. The DNA was linked to Charles Boney, a convicted felon from nearby New Albany. Boney had been out on parole at the time of the crime after being convicted for a series of armed attacks on women, many of which involved stealing their shoes. One of his most recent crimes was an armed robbery and attempted abduction of 3 women at gunpoint. Now, Boney had a disturbing history. Some of his victims reported receiving harassing phone calls for months before the attacks, where he asked what they were wearing and if they wore high-heeled shoes. Boney had also admitted to having a foot fetish, a detail that seemed important to the defense, considering that Kim Camm's shoes had been removed and neatly placed on top of her car in a crime scene that was otherwise chaotic. Kim's feet also showed signs of bruises and abrasions, which seemed suspiciously linked to Boney's past behaviors. Boney was interviewed and took a polygraph test, but the results indicated that he was being deceptive. He denied involvement, claiming he had donated the sweatshirt to charity. However, just 2 weeks later, a palm print from Boney was found on Kim's vehicle, leading to his arrest. But what the police charged him with was conspiring with David to commit the murders. See, Charles ended up giving a 5-page written confession about how he knew David. He said that David seemed like a really sincere guy to him, and apparently they met at a pickup basketball game in New Albany. He also claimed their paths crossed again later at a meat shop, where David asked Charles to buy him an untraceable gun for $250. Charles agreed and delivered the gun, inadvertently leaving his palm print on David's Bronco. However, Charles's story began to change during further questioning. He now claimed that David was a bad guy, accusing him of abusing his daughter, Jill, in an intimate way, and cheating on his wife, Kim. According to Charles, David snapped when Kim discovered everything he was doing to their daughter, and that's when David wanted the whole family dead to cover his secrets. Charles said that before handing over the gun, he wrapped it in a gray sweatshirt to prevent oil leaks. He followed David to his house and waited in the driveway. Charles could hear a heated argument and then a gunshot. In a chilling moment, he described hearing Kim's son Bradley calling out, "Daddy, Daddy," before a gunshot rang out. Moments later, Charles claimed David came outside, aiming the gun at him as if to kill him too. Charles ran for cover in the garage where he moved Kim's shoes as if tidying up while fleeing for his life. After hearing a woman pull into the driveway, Charles fled the scene. In his confession, Charles claimed he only sold the gun to David and did not pull the trigger. He was reluctant to report the murders, fearing the authorities would pin the blame on him, especially as a black man. His statement eventually led to his arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, and he was sent back to jail awaiting trial. After his arrest, it was revealed that Charles had previously spoken to Stan Faith, one of the prosecutors in David's first trial. Charles admitted to knowing Stan well and had consulted with him before being considered a suspect. Stan later expressed regret over his involvement. Another clue emerged when police discovered DNA from Charles's ex-girlfriend, Mala, on the gray sweatshirt. At the time, they were dating, but their relationship ended shortly after the murders. Mala described how Charles had told her he was going to work that evening, but later came home around midnight with scraped knees. He then showed her a gun, something she had never seen before, and she was uncomfortable with it. The next morning, Charles was watching news coverage of the murders with his mother. After a fight, Mala left and did not see Charles for weeks. She later broke up with him, but her blood on the sweatshirt was explained by her being diabetic and frequently pricking her finger for blood sugar tests. Charles's story began to unravel further. Despite claiming he fled the scene without retrieving the gun, his girlfriend's statement contradicted him, suggesting that Charles might have returned for the weapon. This fueled doubts about David's guilt. Still, both men were charged with the murders. While in jail, Charles wrote an autobiography, Blackbone, where he openly discussed selling the gun to David and his role in the murders. He also mentioned that David had promised him Kim's life insurance money in exchange for the gun. Charles's writings, along with his confessions and testimony from Mala, helped secure his conviction for conspiracy to commit murder. In 2005, Charles was sentenced to 225 years in prison as a habitual offender. And if you're asking, what about David? Well, his second trial kicked off on January 17, 2006, and things were about to get even more complicated. Remember, the reason he was granted a retrial in the first place was because the judge ruled that the prosecution had made a mistake by discussing David's many affairs. So, when this second trial began, the courtroom was officially barred from talking about his infidelity, which had initially been one of the prosecution's key arguments. Without that piece of the puzzle, the prosecutors needed a new angle, and they didn't hold back. They pivoted to a shocking accusation. David had been abusing his daughter, Jill, for a long period of time, and to cover up his actions, he murdered his entire family. The allegations were deeply disturbing and immediately made the case even more complex. But David's defense team didn't back down. They brought in a highly regarded medical examiner who stated that during Jill's autopsy there was no evidence of sexual trauma, specifically no damage to her hymen. Of course, this didn't rule out the possibility of other forms of abuse, as some methods wouldn't leave visible damage. But the defense team argued that there wasn't enough proof to suggest sexual assault, and they claimed that the prosecution was exaggerating the evidence to create a narrative that suited their theory of the crime. This expert also pointed out that while Jill did have blunt force injuries, some of which were in her pelvic region, those injuries weren't necessarily indicative of sexual abuse. According to the expert, these were simply injuries sustained during the brutal attack, and there was no concrete evidence to support the prosecution's claims. Now, this trial wasn't just about the allegations against David, it was also about the new evidence that had emerged. Thanks to some investigative work that had tracked down Charles, the police uncovered a wealth of new details, much of which came from Charles himself. They even learned from Charles's own testimony that David had purchased a gun with the intent to murder his family. The defense continued to argue, however, that the prosecution's case wasn't strong enough to convict David beyond a reasonable doubt. After weeks of testimony, on March 1, 2006, the jury convicted David for the murders of his wife Kim and their children, Jill and Brad. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But as soon as he was convicted, David appealed once again, and this time it was due to the abuse allegations involving his daughter. He maintained that there was no evidence to suggest he'd ever harmed Jill, and he argued that the accusations had influenced the jury's decision. And guess what? The Indiana Supreme Court sided with him. In a stunning move, they overturned the conviction, agreeing with David's claim that the prosecution's abuse allegations lacked proper evidence. The court stated that there was no competent evidence to support the sexual abuse accusations. Can you imagine what Kim's family was going through during all this? They had to relive their daughter and grandchildren's horrific deaths, only for it to happen over and over again in the courtroom. Kim's father, Frank, was absolutely devastated by the decision. I was kind of surprised by the overturn of the last verdict. All we want is the truth, and the truth is that David's guilty, he said, his voice full of frustration. Kim's family was determined to see David behind bars for life. They were sick of the back and forth and just wanted justice. Fast forward nearly 13 years later, and David's third trial began in August of 2013. This trial was unlike the previous ones. The prosecution decided to go in a new direction, focusing on the life insurance policy that David had taken out on Kim before her death. According to Charles, David wanted the money, and he wasn't planning to let anyone get in his way. Interestingly, Kim's life insurance policy had been increased shortly before her death, but she had signed off on the changes, meaning she knew about and approved them. Charles took the stand again during this trial, and his testimony was as bombshell as ever. He claimed that David had tricked him into being at the house when the murders happened. Charles also testified that David nearly shot him before he managed to escape. According to Charles, David was the one who did all the killing, and Charles never touched Kim, Jill, or Brad. But David's defense team was ready. They had even more DNA evidence this time around. They presented proof that Charles's DNA was found on Kim's underwear, as well as on Jill's and Kim's clothing. What's more, Charles's DNA was found under Kim's nails, indicating that she had fought back before she was killed. Despite all the DNA evidence and Charles's questionable involvement, the most solid evidence linking David to the crime scene was the blood spatter on his shirt. The prosecution argued that the blood belonged to the victims, but David's defense team insisted that this could easily be explained by the fact that David had tried to help Brad after he was shot in the head, brushing up against his hair and leaving blood on his shirt. After weeks of deliberation and intense courtroom drama, The jury returned their verdict on October 24, 2013. Not guilty on all charges. David was acquitted, and when the news was announced, he was overwhelmed with emotion. He broke down in tears, thanking his legal team and the jury for believing in him. It was a monumental moment after years of intense legal battles. However, not everyone was thrilled with the verdict. The community was divided. After all, 13 years of media coverage had left many wondering if David had truly been innocent. The evidence was strong, but some still felt there were unanswered questions. Despite the controversy, David decided to stay in the same town where it all happened. He got back to work at his uncle's business and started rebuilding his life. As if his trials hadn't been exhausting enough, David filed a civil lawsuit against several members of the prosecution team. You can't wreck someone's life, take away their freedom, their reputation, their identity, and you're not supposed to do that in this country, he said, making his anger clear. In the end, he received a settlement of over $5 million, part of which he used to repay those who supported him throughout his 13-year battle. Today, David is trying to move on. He's rebuilt his life from the ground up, but the pain of losing his family and reputation is still there. Since the acquittal, he's remained in contact with the jury members who helped secure his freedom. He was even hired by the Innocence Project as a case coordinator. The nonprofit works to exonerate wrongfully convicted individuals, and David seems to be a perfect fit for the organization given his own wrongful conviction experience. Meanwhile, Charles, the man at the center of all the controversy, still maintains his innocence. He's claimed to have found Jesus and is now a devout Christian. In recent interviews, he's given several versions of what happened that night, but his story hasn't wavered. He says that on the night of the murder, he took an untraceable weapon to the Camm residence. He claims he heard arguing, followed by shots, and that David was the one who pulled the trigger. It's tough to wrap your head around why Charles did what he did, especially with all the conflicting accounts. Many still believe that David had a role in the murders, but the evidence simply didn't add up to convict him. Some question whether Charles was motivated by greed, jealousy, or something deeper. Now, if you believe David is innocent, it's reassuring to know that he has found peace and freedom, rebuilding his life and career. But if you think he's guilty, it's hard not to wonder how he managed to escape justice. What do you think? Was David truly innocent, or did he get away with murder? And what about Charles? What drove him to take such extreme actions? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you like the way we create these videos, and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you once again for watching.